Hi everybody, it's Stephanie and Hillary here, and today we'll be presenting on legumes. So we know that the theme of this week is legumes, nuts, and seeds, but for the purpose of our presentation, we'll be solely focusing on legumes. So before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So as an overview, we'll be going over what are legumes, Health Canada's recommendations, dried versus canned legumes, our grocery experience, cooking dried legumes, storage of legumes, and finally, our recipe activity. So what is a legume? As a refresher, legumes are plants in the bean family, and they bear pods that contain several seeds. These include peas, beans, lentils, and peanuts. Legumes are high in minerals and fiber, and they are rich in protein. They've also been found to lower cholesterol levels. Bean flavor is associated with the enzyme lipoxygenase, which breaks unsaturated fatty acids into small odorous molecules. The aroma of cooked beans has a distinct sweet note from organic compounds such as lactones, furans, and maltol. Now we'll be talking about Health Canada's recommendations. So, as a part of the messaging in the 2019 Canada's Food Guide, plant-based proteins are emphasized to be a part of healthy eating. It is stated, choose protein foods that come from plants more often. Plant-based protein foods can provide more fiber and less saturated fat than other types of protein foods. This can be beneficial for your heart health. So diets higher in plant-based foods tend to be higher in fiber and lower in saturated fat, both of which lower your risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. For example, eating more nuts or soy protein is linked to improved blood lipid levels. Higher fiber intake is linked to improved blood lipid levels and a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, and type 2 diabetes. Processed meats have been linked to colorectal cancer, and foods that contain mostly saturated fats are linked to unfavorable blood lipid levels and a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. So, although it is recommended that people eat more plant-based proteins, it doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot eat any meat or milk products. Moreover, the new food guide includes a section on how to eat more protein foods that come from plants, which lists suggestions on how to incorporate foods such as tofu, beans, and other legumes into our meals and snacks. The messaging on increasing consumption of legumes also benefits Canadian farmers, as the prairies are home to the largest pulse areas in the country, and Canada is one of the leading producers and exporters of pulses worldwide. So we just have a first question for you guys, which is to compare dried beans versus canned beans. So in the picture below, we see 3 bowls, and one bowl is filled with dried chickpeas. The second bowl is filled with dried chickpeas that have then been soaked. And finally, the last bowl is filled with canned chickpeas. So based on the picture below, can you guys identify the differences in texture, size, appearance, and color of the dried beans that have been soaked versus the canned beans? And you guys can answer this question in the discussion board posted on Canvas. So after Hillary and I took a look at the chickpeas, we came to the conclusion that for texture, the soaked beans were harder and had a more distinct shape. For size, the soaked beans and the canned beans were around the same size. And then for color, the soaked beans had a more vibrant yellow color, whereas the color of the canned beans leached out into the aquafaba, making it more pale. The second question that we have is, what are some factors we need to consider when deciding between dried beans and canned beans? And you guys can post your answers in the discussion board as well. So things that we need to consider are cost. So dry beans typically cost less per serving than canned beans, and we'll be talking more about that later on in our grocery store experience. And then the next thing we need to consider is convenience. So if you want to save time, cook with canned beans, as dry beans can take about 3 to 24 hours depending on soaking and the cooking method. We have to sort, rinse, soak, and cook dry beans, before we're ready to add them into a recipe, whereas cooking with canned beans is as easy as opening the can. Another option is to cook in larger batches of dry beans and then freeze them, providing both the cost savings of dry beans and the convenience of a ready-to-use canned ingredient. The next thing we want to consider is control. So if you want less sodium, cook with dry beans. Dry beans with no added salt is virtually sodium-free, while canned beans contain approximately 200 milligrams of sodium. You can drain and rinse canned beans to remove around 40% of the sodium, and you can also buy low-sodium versions of many canned bean products. And finally, the last thing that we need to consider is flavor. So, dried beans that are well seasoned and cooked with aromatics have a complex earthiness and a wonderful starchy sweetness, while canned beans provide a one-dimensional flavor. So now I'll be talking a little bit more about our grocery store experience. So during our experience, we noticed that there were more options and brands for the canned chickpeas rather than for the dried chickpeas. However, there was a variety of dried and canned legumes, for example, lentils, black beans, and kidney beans. We went to Safeway to buy our ingredients for the recipe that we've selected today, but we noticed that the dried legumes and the canned legumes are actually quite accessible in most grocery stores everywhere. And we noticed that the canned chickpeas ended up being more expensive than the dried chickpeas, as we also had to subtract around 120 milliliters of the volume to account for the aquafaba. So canned beans were not that much more expensive at 55 cents per 100 milliliters, which is what we counted as one serving. And then dried beans were around 42 cents for 100 grams, which is one serving of the dried chickpeas. So now that we have our dried legumes, the next thing to do is to prepare them. So the first step is cleaning. So sift through the legumes and look for any that are off-colored, shriveled, or damaged, and also keep an eye out for small stones. So in the picture accompanying the slide, Hillary and I soaked some dried chickpeas, and then one ended up being off-colored, while the one on the right ended up being normal color. So this cleaning step is important, or else you're going to end up like us and then end up with some off-colored chickpeas. And then the next step is to rinse under cold running water to remove any of the surface dust. And then soak the beans if desired and then drain. So certain thin-skinned legumes such as split peas or lentils can skip this step. And then for others, we can soak them by covering the beans with water at least 2 inches above the beans in the pot. We'll let them stand, covered for around 12 hours or overnight. And then we have the other option of quick soaking, which is to bring the legumes to a boil and boil for around 2 minutes. After that, we can remove them from the heat and let them stand for around an hour before cooking.
There are 4 different cooking methods for cooking legumes. For each method, put the legumes into a large pot and cover with at least 2 inches of water. For the stovetop method, bring the pot to a boil and remove foam from the pot like what you see in the picture there, and then reduce the heat to a simmer and cook until tender. For the slow cooker, add the aromatics in and set to slow. Then cook until the legumes become tender. For the pressure cooker, add the aromatics in and as well add at least 1 tablespoon of oil, and this helps keep the foam from clogging the vent. Pressure cooking is a useful method because it can cut the cooking time by half or more. Then cook at a high pressure, and for small legumes, cook it for about 5 to 10 minutes, and for larger beans, 35 to 40 minutes. For cooking in the oven, bring the pot to a boil on the stove first, then put it in the oven, cover, and bake until tender. So we have a question for you on Canvas. What are the factors that affect cooking time? And by this, we mean differences in the bean, not added factors such as acidity or salt. All right, so cooking times vary depending on the type of legume being cooked, as you see in the table there. However, water hardness, the age of the bean or the storage time, and growing conditions may vary greatly in required cooking times. The simple definition of water hardness is the amount of dissolved calcium and magnesium in the water. Hard water is high in dissolved minerals, largely calcium and magnesium, which affects texture and appearance of food and nutrients. For legumes, this means a longer cooking time. And as well, growing conditions include crop rotations, humidity, sunlight, and soil fertility. And as well as beans age while they're stored, they lose moisture, and very dry beans take longer to cook. Cooking times may also be adjusted depending on its intended use. For example, dishes like salads, where is important, it's important to cook the beans until just tender. If the beans are to be further cooked or are frozen, continue cooking until they become soft. All right, to test for doneness, you should actually do this before the cooking time is up. The beans should be tender but retain their shape, and to test this, take the bean out of the pot and blow on it and see if the skin breaks. If it does, then it's done. So here are some ingredients that affect cooking time. Ingredients such as acid, sugar, and calcium will slow down the cooking time of legumes as they reinforce the cell wall structure, which slows down the softening process and stops the starch from swelling as fast. By adding sugar or an acidic ingredient like tomatoes, we can cook legumes for a prolonged period of time to maintain the integrity of the bean to prevent the bean from becoming too soft. On the other hand, salt and baking soda speed up the cooking time because they weaken the cell wall structure. It's recommended to add 2 tablespoons of salt per 1 liter of water and 1 teaspoon of baking soda per 1 liter of water. However, it's good to note that baking soda can give the beans an unpleasant, slippery mouthfeel and a soapy taste, and salt can give the beans a mealy internal texture rather than a creamy one. So to store legumes, dried legumes can be stored in a container in a dry area, and cooked legumes can be stored in a fridge or a freezer. In the fridge, it can last up to 2 days. In the freezer, maybe about 6 months, and you should use a freezer bag or freezer containers. And as well, it's best to store cooked legumes in their cooking liquid to help them, to protect them and keep the skins from drying. So for our recipe activity, we cook chana masala, which is an Indian chickpea stew. The ingredients we used were olive oil, onion, garlic cloves, chickpeas, garam masala, turmeric, fresh ginger, tomatoes, lemon juice, and fresh cilantro. Oh, and as well, we used dried chickpeas and canned chickpeas to compare them. For the cooking method, we heated the oil in a pot and added the onion and sauteed them until they were translucent. Then we added the garlic and continued to saute. Then we added the chickpeas, garam masala, turmeric, ginger, tomatoes, lemon juice, and about 1/4 cup of water. We brought the pot to a simmer and then cooked over low-medium heat for about 20 minutes. We stirred until it was moist and stew-like but not soupy, and we added a little more water during the cooking process when we needed it. At the end, we stirred in some cilantro and served it over rice. So for the dry chickpeas, we actually soaked them for over 4 hours, and then we cooked them in a separate pot before adding it to our chana masala. So for the taste test, well, since you guys couldn't taste it, we tasted it for you. Some factors that we considered were texture, starchiness, flavor, appearance, and size. And actually, we do have a question for you on Canvas. We want you to guess which is which. So is dish number 1 canned or dried, or is dish number 2 canned or dried? So you can tell us what you think and why you think that. All right, so actually dish number 1, we used the canned chickpeas, and we found the texture to be a little bit more tender and less starchy. However, this greatly depends on how long you cook the dried chickpeas in that separate pot. So it may be because we didn't cook it as long as it needed to. However, the canned chickpeas still held its shape well, but it did have a stronger beany flavor. However, the longer we cooked the canned chickpeas, the less beany flavor there was, but it still had a stronger beany flavor than the dried chickpeas. The longer we cooked it, the more it took on the flavor of the spices, so that was good. And the appearance of the canned chickpeas was definitely paler than the dried chickpeas. And the size of the chickpeas were both the same between canned and dried. So dish number 2, we used the dried chickpeas. As I said, the texture was more firm and starchy than the canned chickpeas. The flavor definitely had a more complex earthy flavor, a much less beany flavor, and the spices were absorbed even better. The appearance had a more bold golden color, and it also absorbed the colors of the spices better than the canned chickpeas. And as well, as I said, the sizes were the same. In conclusion, legumes are plants that bear pods. They're an excellent plant-based protein alternative, and they definitely provide more fiber and less saturated fat than animal proteins. And to cook legumes, you can use the stovetop, a slow cooker, a pressure cooker, or even the oven. And when cooking legumes, it's important to consider ingredients that have acid, salt, and calcium because this affects the tenderness. And comparing dried beans to canned, dried costs a little bit less and you have a lot more control for sodium. There's definitely a more complex earthy flavor, and as well, soaking can help decrease the cooking time so it's not that inconvenient to prepare. Canned beans are definitely quicker to prepare as they are already cooked when they're in the can. There are no salt added options, so you do have some control for sodium there. And as well, they do have a more one-dimensional flavor, so that's important to consider when you choose between cooking dried beans and canned beans. All right. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and you can ask us any questions that you have in Canvas. All right, thank you.